Hey, folks, it's the final Darkmoon Faire card review. Seems impossible, but hey, thanks for hanging out with me every day for the last week or two, sometimes twice a day. It's cool to have something we're all excited about and get to collectively come together, even if we disagree on cards. It's just cool to have a place to chat every day. So thanks for joining me. Thanks for having me. And look forward to playing these cards. But we still got 30 cards to talk about, so let's get into it. Starting off here with the final legendary. It's G'huun the Blood God for Priest. And kind of the cousin of the old gods here. The step sibling, some might say. He's an 8 mana 8/8. Battle Cry, draw 2 cards. And those cards then cost health instead of mana. So pretty interesting opportunity here for this card. Of course, a big body as an 8/8 there. Refill your hand a little bit. That's great. And it's cards you can theoretically play right away, making this, a bigger tempo-y play at 8 mana where you maybe drop in a few big threats simultaneously. If you draw some big threats, maybe some board clear, whatever it is, G'huun offers you the opportunity to spend a lot more mana than you'd otherwise be able to in a single turn. So in some cases, it might be kind of like getting, a 0 mana G'huun at the cost, of course, of some life. And that's the hard part for this card for me, is that when it excels, it's also sometimes risky or problematic. Because, even though it's Priest, even though Priest has a lot of healing and life gain, you still don't want to take 16 damage and, develop 3 8 mana cards or whatever it is, or 2 10 mana cards that take 20 damage. That's still sometimes going to put you in a lethal territory where your opponent might just kill you. And if you don't want to take that risk, or you're not putting those cards into play via their health instantly, then G'huun's not really doing much. He's just an 8 mana 8/8, which isn't very exciting. There's a lot bigger and better plays in Hearthstone. So I'm worried it's going to take these perfect windows for G'huun to really work out well. Of course, maybe you just play one of the cards. Maybe you don't need to play both. And then this feels kind of like a Dragon Queen Alexstrasza-esque thing, but a Dragon Queen that's drawing cards from your deck instead of random ones. So hopefully the card quality is a little bit higher. Maybe you just, happy to get a 5-drop and you just take 5 damage and that's okay because you've swung pretty hard. My question is, does Priest need that late game bomb sort of thing? When I've played Priest, they've had a lot of cards in hand, so the card draw doesn't seem especially valuable. They have big swing stuff in the late game anyway. There's already the Murazon turns and all that. So I don't know if I'm excited about that. Now they've got all this discount stuff. I'm just not sure when I'm playing this card and when I'm super excited about it. I've seen some great responses to this. Oh, it's awesome and strong. I want to like it a lot because I love the idea of another old god joining the party. That's cool. I love big cards like this. I think it's a fun mechanic. But I'm not convinced it's a particularly strong mechanic. I think this card's going to be more awkward than good, unfortunately. All right, so next up, let's move over to Blood of G'huun. I love this blood theme for Priest. It's awesome. It feels kind of Warlocky, but I'm cool with it. I'm happy to see it in Priest. This is a 9 mana 8/8 elemental, which is pretty nifty for a N'Zoth build in Priest potentially. Keep an eye on that. It's got Taunt, which I definitely like for big minions like this where you're spending a lot of mana. And at the end of your turn, it will summon you a 5/5 copy of a minion in your deck. So this is just one of those big late game board builders. Kind of reminds me of Big Bad Archmage in a way. We've seen some stuff like this in Priest in the past with Big Priest, Res Priest sort of things. That said, this is pretty late in the game to be summoning things from your deck compared to what Big Priest would do in the past. But you're getting this 8/8 body on top of it as well. And then you've got this interesting scenario where you could pull a Blood of G'huun. It won't instantly fill your board at the end of turn, but if one sticks around, it could really be this kind of snowball where it's man, I keep getting more Blood of G'huuns, and your opponent just can't deal with all the Blood of G'huuns, and you're rezzing Blood of G'huuns, and it's just an endless swarm of Blood of G'huuns. I don't think that's especially likely, or maybe even all that powerful in the scheme of things, but you could definitely see how something like that would get out of control, because this is one of those big value bomb late game cards. That said, again, I think Priest right now is achieving their value via card generation, not via big stats on board necessarily. So I don't know if a deck like this is going to thrive necessarily compared to what Priest can do, but it's always a possibility that a card like this is just big enough and good enough, and it has minions in deck that are powerful enough that you create a big wall of taunts and defensive stuff, and basically that's Priest's way to get out of the late game, swing hard, and create counter pressure that just ends games for them on all these big bodies. Whereas like a warrior just can't keep up with all this stuff, and that's how they win their control grindy matchups. So an interesting card with some promise. I just don't think it's something you're going to see as a tier 1 deck or see particularly often. Next up is the Fairground Fool, a 3-mana 4/3 taunt minion. If you corrupt it, it's going to gain 4 health, making it a 3-mana 4/7 taunt minion. That's obviously a pretty big taunt for 3 mana. The downside, of course, is that it's a taunt that's coming down later in the game because of corrupt. We keep having this same issue, but it could easily fill in a nice, curve spot later in the game. You don't have much to do with Priest. You're playing a 3 or 4 mana card. This slots in to help you kind of stabilize while getting ready to push into the late game and do big stuff. And you know what? In some scenarios, I guess a 4/3 taunt's not the end of the world if you have to play it the early game for Priest, just because it gives you something to do, maybe something to resurrect that isn't the end of the world. That said, I still think Priest is better taunts, better early to mid-game taunts even, better minions that are generating more value and playing more towards the game plan that Priest really cares about, which is outvaluing, outgrinding your opponent. I don't know that this one contributes to that game plan as successfully. It's really just stats at the end of the day, and often Priest can do a lot more than just stats. So I'm worried about a card like Fairground Fool just making a spot for itself. It's going to have to push out some really good cards to get there, and I don't think it's going to be able to. Next up is Insight, a 2-mana spell for Priest. It draws you a minion, and then if you corrupt it, you reduce that minion's cost by 2 when you draw it. So basically, at a base level, this is just a little bit of a cycle. Arguably a tutor that could help you find a specific minion if you build your deck to only have one minion or a key set of minions. That could be an important use case for Insight, because we do have a lot of crazy spell stuff happening at Priest. Keep an eye on that. But more generally speaking, just cycles into something playable, hopefully, for you, and often does it free, because corrupting this won't be especially difficult since it's down at 2 mana. It's going to slot in really easily into a mid-game turn. Play this, cycle, and it feels fine. That said, this is one of those cards that doesn't really feel like it's probably going to get in your deck list. You're probably going to run more directed, more specific, more awesome stuff. This is a card that's important to exist off of random generation effects. This is going to be great in a Spell Priest when a Sethic Veilweaver generates it. It may not be corrupted right away, but it might get discounted anyway, and you're just popping through these to help fill your deck and fill your hand, with more stuff to do. So a really important card and a solid, reasonable card, but probably not a card that's often run in deck lists, although certainly possible. Next up, here's the Ring Matron. As we move into Warlock, this is a 6-mana 6/4 demon, taunt, and Deathrattle summon 2/3/2 imps. I'm curious what the imps look like. I haven't seen them yet. Oh, okay, cool. So this is Savannah Highmane. It's frankly a better Savannah Highmane for Warlock, I think, because it has taunts and the Deathrattle's a little bit higher pressure than the Savannah Highmane. And you know what? I think this card's got some interesting things going on. This might be a little bit of a sleeper based on the reactions I've seen thus far. Now, Savannah Highmane's not a great card these days, obviously. Historically, of course, awesome, but these days doesn't really make the cut. It's a little slow, but Taunt already fixes that problem for the Ring Matron. You can play this on a board more readily and easily than Savannah Highmane. Savannah Highmane, you play it sometimes now, you just get ran over, nobody cares, they ignore it, whatever. With Ring Matron, they gotta force into it, which means it buys you a little bit of time. You realize that Deathrattle perhaps sooner, and then they got to deal with these 3/2s, or they're leaving you behind some great minions to attack, trade, etc. So I think this is notably better than Savannah Highmane. On top of that, there are some neat synergies. We got some demon discount stuff we're going to talk about in a second. We've got cards like Willow, where I think this would actually be a great minion off of Willow. It's just another big taunt demon. So a few different vectors where you might be able to put this into a deck list and it makes sense. Even just like a control Warlock could probably use another big defensive taunt body, and these sticky stats can help it trade in the future, push some damage, etc. So I think this card is actually pretty solid. And, as someone who looks like the Ring Matron, I'm all about empowering cards like this one. Moving on to the Menari Mosher, a 3-mana 3/4 demon, Battlecry. Give a friendly demon +3 attack and lifesteal this turn. This is another card I actually like a lot. I think that +3 attack buff is pretty interesting. Way back in the day, we had a card, Dark Iron Dwarf. They got played a fair bit in zoo decks. This is basically a way better Dark Iron Dwarf because it's cheaper. The attack buff is higher. That's great if you've got like a 1/1 lingering around on board and you want to trade it into, say, your opponent's 4 health minion, or you just want to push 3 face damage. sometimes that's going to be worth it in a zoo deck. And this has a really good body for its stats too as a 3-mana 3/4. So I think this will be a great on-curve play in some aggressive decks. Could be a helpful finisher tool to push some damage, which often zoo decks lack. It's like they got soul fires and stuff, but it's hard sometimes to just get over the hump. A card like this could solve that problem as long as you got some attacks on board. So demon synergies, attack buff, solid body. I don't know if the lifesteal matters much. I don't think that's necessarily important to how I envision this card being played, but it's a free bonus. It never hurts to buy a little bit of time, maybe in an aggro race scenario. If you're trying to stay alive, that could really help. So all in all, I think this is a really solid card. Free Admission's a new 3-mana spell for Warlock. Man, the flavor on some of these is fantastic, by the way. Really digging some of these cards. Draw 2 minions. If they're both demons, reduce their cost by 2. So this is what I teased for some demon discount stuff. That means you can have that 4-mana Savannah Highmane on curve with free admission, which I think is pretty crazy good. Like, that's strong. That said, you got to ask yourself what kind of deck is running this exactly. Because if you're playing like a more aggressive zoo-style deck, you probably don't want to spend your 3-mana turn drawing stuff for the future. So this is probably going in a little bit of a like mid-rangey or grindier demon deck. I don't know if it'd fit in a control deck even. Maybe if you want to put some great demons in your deck that are big taunts and stuff, it still does to help cheese out those taunts sooner. So you got your Savannah Highmane, whose name I already forgot. You got your big 5/7 lifesteal lady from Ashes of Outland, whose name I don't know. You got some options here to put this in that defensive Deathrattle style demon, as long as you're only running demon minions, which is a bit of a challenge to get those discounts. But I don't think it's that crazy or ridiculous of a challenge, but certainly you could hit a Willow, mess up the discount. But if you got enough demons, maybe you take the risk anyway, because drawing 2 cards for 3 mana is not bad at a base level. Even if this backfires, sometimes that would still be a completely fine play, particularly because it tutors minions specifically out of your deck. Some decks might just care about that fact alone. So a card with a lot of interesting utility and some real lines of play, I think. And then finally for Warlock, it's the Midway Maniac, a 2-mana 1/5 demon with taunt here. Pretty annoying body at 2 mana with taunt for sure. A lot of opponents are like, oh, I do not want to have to push through this thing. So, you know, in a world with a lot of 1/1s floating around, Wilpertingers and stuff on turn 1, maybe this could be a tool that Warlock uses to shut that down. Unfortunately, though, I think the 1 attack is really where this one suffers, is like as soon as you get past that Wilpertinger turn, this is not going to trade well into many boards. It's barely even a speed bump for a lot of decks to push through this. Maybe if you can buff it, maybe you could use it in a zoo deck to protect other things, but I don't really think so. I don't think this is going to be good enough compared to other options that exist for zoo or control Warlocks at similar mana cost. It feels like this is definitely going to fall off hard. Moving on to Warrior here with the Sword Eater, a new 4-mana 2/5 pirate with taunt. He's eating a sword, literally. And his battle cry is equip a 3/2 sword. This card seems really, really strong as far as I'm concerned. So a few things to talk about here, right? Pirate for N'Zoth build actually makes a lot of sense here. You want, I think, taunt minions as much as possible in N'Zoth, or rush minions, whatever, instant interaction minions, and this is one of the bigger pirates, and it has taunt, which probably makes it the most suitable fit for N'Zoth. That's awesome. +1 point there. Beyond that, I think this is a just generally amazing card. You get a Fiery War Axe with a bonus, essentially 1 mana 2/5. That's going to be great, whether that's being used defensively to keep your opponent's board in check in the mid game, or sometimes aggressively. I think this fits in a Pirate Warrior. I think you run this even in aggressive decks, despite its more defensive alignment and stat line, because sometimes it's great to plop down those minions to protect things like your South Sea Captains and your other more aggressively minded pirates on board. So I think this fits in like just general control decks. Is a great speed bump with a fantastic weapon attached. I think it fits in pirate decks, N'Zoth decks. I think you could run it in just about any warrior deck and feel pretty happy with this, because it's a nice combination of aggression with the weapon, defense with the body, just output. It's got a lot of stats. There's many things going on. This seems like an incredibly flexible, very powerful card. Moving on to the Feat of Strength, the 3-mana spell for Warrior. Gives a random taunt minion in your hand +5/+5. That is a big hand buff specific to taunts. We've had a lot of fun with like taunt hand buff Warrior stuff in the past, but unfortunately, I'm really nervous about this one because it it isolates all of the stats onto a single minion, which I don't think is great in Hearthstone these days. It's just too susceptible to removal and silences and all these other things when you're investing that much in a singular play. I like other things that are spreading out the taunt hand buffs and such, because it diversifies your threats and you're not super committed into one big thing. A single devolving missiles is just, that's it. Any kind of hard removal, it's done, and you've wasted basically 2 cards instead of just 1. So because this is bundling all of it down into something specific, I'm worried that's just too susceptible to far too many decks. And even though, it's efficient, 5/5 for 3 mana is great, it's delayed, and it's really, really, really heavily committed, and those are big problems. Next up here is the Stagehand, a 2 mana 3/2 mech for warrior, and it's got Battle Cry. Give a random minion in your hand +1/+1. So a little bit of a hand buff here, but really not much of a hand buff. Only a single +1/+1 for 2 mana. I mean, sure, it's attached to a reasonably fine body for 2 mana, but there's just nothing here to get me excited at all. Nothing about the stats. It's a mech, which I don't think I care about. There's other better mechs if you're trying to do a mech thing or a Nazoth thing. There's other better hand buff cards if you're trying to do hand buff stuff. This just seems like a really underwhelming card. I don't even have much to say because it's just not particularly exciting in any form or fashion. Next up is Minefield, the 2 mana spell, deal 5 damage, randomly split among all minions. So this is kind of like Warrior's Dark Skies from Warlock, but at 2 mana and capped at 5, but also there's no floor on this either. Sometimes Dark Skies, if you only had 1 card in hand, would be garbage. Unlikely, but possible. Minefield's always dealing 5, and it's potentially doing it either more affordably or sooner. And you know what? I think this is a reasonably good tool to help you keep up with a couple of those early starts from your opponent. They get, a few 2 health minions on board by turn 2. You slam the Minefield, you reset things, and that's not too bad. The question is this a card Warrior makes room for in a deck list? Do they have other higher priority removal tools that they'd rather utilize? Or alternatively, is this something Warrior could ever use even aggressively by activating things like Enrage style effects, where you want multiple triggers going off instead of like Whirlwind, which hits more minions, but perhaps if you only had 1 minion on board and you wanted it to get hit 5 times, Minefield could do that. I mean, Gurubashi Berserker is the example that comes to mind. Not a great one, I'm sure, right now, not a reason to do that. But if a minion like that existed, sure, I think you could use this offensively. So some neat extra utility here compared to Warlock, which I think makes this an intriguing card. It still probably doesn't make it into most lists, I'm sure. But it's got some promise, certainly. Moving on to the bumper car. It's 2 mana 1/3 mech with Rush. And Deathrattle, add 2 1/1 riders with Rush to your hand. I love the idea of all these cards. We're going to talk about another one eventually too, where it's like there's a crash on the ride, and the riders are like running from the crash or running from the old gods. They have Rush, I guess. So, not too excited about bumper car here, basically. There's a lot going on, but I just don't think the numbers are significant enough. The 1/3 rush on 2, it's like, yeah, maybe it cleans up a 1/1, but that falls off really hard later in the game, where this is probably not a great minion any other time. Also, this Deathrattle, it's going to be hard to force that into action when you might want it. Like at 3 health, it's enough that it's going to survive against those 1/1s. Maybe not die for a little while. Those other rush riders don't come back until later. I mean, the one interesting angle is maybe with ETC Rock God, where you're just getting a lot of these 1/1 riders with Rush in your hand, and then that's setting up a big ETC turn where you're doing a lot of damage. But I don't necessarily see that coming together being worth it to run a bunch of maybe suboptimal Rush minions to make that work. I think ETC is less of a build around and more of like a complementary card. So I don't think that saves bumper car, like execute activations or whatever, don't seem worth it either. Other rush synergies don't really seem to work great on 1/1. So all in all, it's all nice, but I just don't see it coalescing into anything really compelling. And then finally here for Warrior, it's Stage Dive, a 1 mana spell. It draws you a rush minion, and then it if you corrupt it, it gives that rush minion +2/+1. And I think this is a really interesting card. Number one, super easy to corrupt this one. It's not going to be hard at all. And it fits the game plan for the corrupt on it as well, where it's like, yeah, you don't need to do this necessarily right away or on turn 1. You can probably wait a little bit, fill this in on the mana curve anytime, really, you got that spare mana, and you're moving further into your deck, and you're getting a nice buff to boot. Rush minions in particular utilize these stats well. It's going to help you trade into more stuff, maybe get a value trade you wouldn't otherwise with that +1. Could also just help you tutor into very specific things. Maybe you want to run Kargath Blade Fist and get the Kargath on the back half if that's the only Rushman in your deck. Maybe unlikely in Warrior, but a possibility for those sorts of things. So keep those ideas in mind as well. This just seems like a really nice tutor tool for Warrior. Moving over to Druid with the Umbral Owl. Pretty crazy looking owl here, by the way. 7 mana 4/4 rush, costs 1 less for each spell you've cast this game. I think this is pretty intriguing because it's not hard for Druid to cast a lot of spells. We've seen a ton of support for that already. And I think that means this is very often and very quickly going to be, you know, a 2 mana or less owl that I don't think you mind playing a 4/4 rush at 2, 1, or 0 mana, particularly with some of the big swing turns that seem possible with Druid. This looks like it could be a great tool to help you make sure you don't die on any of those given swing turns, trading off into your opponent's stuff nicely. That said, you know, it's still a card you have to carve out space for, and if you're running a lot of spells and other big power plays, it's harder and harder to make things like this fit into the list because it might not be a big enough swing. It's like consistent, it's pretty smooth feeling, but is it big enough? Is it important enough to make the cut? So that's what we'll have to keep in mind for the Umbral Owl. So it is pretty limited on the kinds of decks it would fit into, I think, because you got to have enough spell consistency. But I don't know. I like 0 mana 4/4 rushes pretty darn well, and cost discount cards like this often just seem to make the cut in Hearthstone, so a lot of promise here. Moving on to the Moon Touched Amulet, a 3 mana spell. Gives your hero +4 attack this turn at a base level, and then if you corrupt it, you also gain 6 armor. So if things go perfectly well for you here with the Moon Touched Amulet, this is, you know, a slightly better bite. But that's the problem for this card. It's a slightly better bite. Bite is not a card we see played in Hearthstone really. And I think this is only occasionally better, and it's more awkward because of the corrupt aspect. So no, I don't think this card's any good at all. I don't think the extra 2 armor is worth it. I don't know that it'll be particularly difficult to corrupt, but top deck scenarios just wouldn't be that good anyway. I'm not convinced this is a card that Druid needs at all. There are cheaper, better spells for spell builds, more defensive cards. This one just feels really weak to me. Sure, you randomly generate it sometimes, you're fine, but otherwise never going to play this in a deck list. And then finally here, the Faire Arborist, a 3 mana 2/2. And it's got some choose one options. You draw a card, or you summon a 2/2 Treant. And if you corrupt it, you get to do both. And let's, I guess, take a look at his artwork real quick. Prune the fruit or dig it up. And here's the corrupted version. Oh, that's sick. I like this card pretty darn well, actually. I think the interesting part about it is that I think it's solid even on either choose one option at a base level. I don't think you have to corrupt this necessarily for it to feel reasonable. We've got 3 mana summon 2 2/2s. That's a playable sort of card in the past. It's something like Landscaping. Only one's a Treant here, but still, it's a lot of bodies for 3 mana. Reasonably statted bodies at that. And then sometimes 3 mana draw a card with a 2/2 attached is pretty reasonable as well. I don't think that's the end of the world. Happy play sometimes. You just need to cycle. Not the best, but reasonable. And then corrupting this at 3 mana is not especially hard either. So I think there'll be many instances where this is just an awesome card that does all 3 of those. It's always a question about deck fit, though. Is there any deck that makes room for this where they need the Treant or they need the cycle? There's a lot of like Treant synergy stuff that already cycles your cards really well. But I don't know. I think this card does enough that there will be a deck out there that makes room for this. I think it makes sense. And it's got a lot of potential upside. All right, so now moving into the neutral cards, starting off with Safety Inspector, 1 mana 1/3, Battlecry, shuffle the lowest cost card from your hand into your deck, and then you draw a card. So basically trading off the lowest cost card in your hand for something new, random in your deck. And the cool thing about this is it's a nice 1 mana 1/3. We've seen that just be important enough for some decks in some scenarios. And I think it's 1 mana 1/3 that has some neat top deck potential. Usually you top deck a 1-drop, you're like, oh, that's garbage. This could allow you to trade in something really weak in hand for something, you know, higher cost, marginally better, or more impactful if you top deck your Safety Inspector. So it's like a little bit of dual utility there. That said, there's also some potential backfires with Safety Inspector, where if you play this on turn 1, it might like shuffle away your turn 2 play, and then you ruin your curve. So if your deck's not built correctly with enough low mana cards or low cost stuff, This one might be more of a liability than an advantage to run, especially if you care a lot about stats early and tempo early, which it seems like this card would point towards. So if there's any other option for you at 1 mana that has reasonably similar stat lines, I think you're probably going to be better off with those. But there might be a deck list that values that top deck potential or just the ability to trade in weak stuff for potentially better stuff as well if the curve is right. So interesting, but I imagine this card probably falls to the wayside more than it really becomes important. Moving on to the Costumed Entertainer here. A 2-mana 1/2 with a battle cry that gives a random in your hand, +2/+2. So theoretically, a total of 3/4 in stats here for 2 mana. But the problem with a card like this is you're backloading the stats into something in the future, and it's something random. So it could be something that's way in the future. You hit your 6-drop. You're sacrificing all these early tempo options for something that doesn't pay off until way later, potentially never paying off if the game ends sooner. So I think most decks would rather just run a good 2-drop that's doing something faster, more immediate. There's a lot of great 2-drops in the game, various class cards. I don't think any hand buff is significant enough that this is worth it. Even if you're doing like crazy charge minion shenanigans, seems like there might still be better hand buffs and better 2-mana plays for things like Hunter that might care about that. So I don't see how the Costume Entertainer really makes sense for any kind of deck. Moving on to the Parade Leader, a 2-mana 2/3. After you summon a rush minion, give it +2 attack. So, I mean, this is basically Warsong Commander, but rush minions is way better. It's just like I don't know. Anyway, I don't think it's very good, right? It's basically a 2-mana tax to get slightly better rush minions, and I don't think you're often going to care enough to spend that 2 mana to do that. I think there's way better rush synergy stuff that exists for classes that are running a lot of rush, which is the only time this would be worth it. The 2-mana 2/3 is not interesting anymore in Hearthstone. So this one just doesn't look all that interesting to me. I don't know why anybody would run this card. The prize vendor here, new 2-mana 2/3 Murloc. And the battle cry is that both players draw a card. So Cold Light Oracle, light coming back to Hearthstone. But that light's really the problem for this one. The reason Cold Light Oracle was so good is because it drew multiple cards very efficiently for 3 mana. So if you cared a lot about having more cards and didn't care so much about your opponents, it was a great way to just cycle into a lot of stuff. If you wanted to do mill shenanigans with your Cold Light Oracle, that milled twice as much, or potentially twice as much, than the prize vendor here provides. So even though this is more efficient from a mana and stat standpoint, it's not as directed. It's not as, high impact as something like the Cold Light Oracle. So the efficiency I don't think is worth it, because the things you cared about more were the intensity of that effect, not the sort of efficiency of it. Maybe this still makes sense in something like a Murloc list, where you're just happy to cycle a card and have a reasonably statted Murloc to play. So Paladin and Shaman might have some angles on this one, but otherwise I don't think this is all that exciting. Next up here is Rock Rager, a 2-mana 5/1 elemental with Taunt. At first I thought this was 3 mana and I was like, oh man, that's really bad. And then I saw it was 2 mana and then I was like, oh man, it's probably still pretty bad. It's a little more interesting, but it's just 1 health. It doesn't work. You can't do it. There's too many pings. It's far too easy to deal with. I just don't know what deck makes this work. I mean, we did see the Paladin thing that buffs stuff with 1 health. So there's like a little bit of an angle there where you make this like a 6/3 for 2 mana. That's intriguing, but it's still not that survivable even there. And there's probably better plays to make even then, more survivable plays. The damage upside here just doesn't seem worth it. The taunt upside doesn't seem worth it. So slightly more promising than most Ragers thanks to its cost and some interesting synergy cards, but I still unfortunately think not quite good enough. The Showstopper here, new neutral minion, 2-mana 3/2 Deathrattle Silence all minions. So an intriguing little card here, a big effect for it really, but a bit of a delayed effect, which is probably the issue here for Silence. I mean, you're not going to want to have to kill off your own minions to silence stuff in most cases, whether that's to like silence away a freeze or negative effects. It's just too much work to spend the 2 mana on this and then kill it. So more realistically, you play this in hopes that if your opponent plays like a big taunt or something, you can just trade this in and get through the taunt or deny their fancy death rattle, whatever it might be. So it's sort of a preemptive, proactive silence, which I don't think is great. I think we want reactive silences, because it's going to be really hard to predict when you're supposed to do this. Your opponent knows it's happening, so they can choose not to play into it or just kill it before they play their big thing. So it just seems like it's way too susceptible to your opponent seeing it and reacting, and too susceptible to finding the right moment for it. I don't know how you fit this card in. Moving on to the Wriggling Horror here. A 2-mana 2/1 neutral card. With the battle cry, give adjacent minions +1/+1. Listen, I think this is a sneaky good card, I think. We saw in the past Fungalmancer be a card that shocked me because I was like, oh man, nobody's going to want to do that. That's 5 mana. That's not worth it. This guy is similar, but much, much more flexible, cheaper. I think this could really help you cement some early board advantages in any kind of minion-based tempo deck. So Zoo Warlock comes to mind most readily. You're developing a little bit of extra body, but also just really investing, making your 1/1s into 2/2s is a big deal, right? Like all these little things start to add up. The Wriggling Horror seems like damage, board solidification. It's super flexible at a low-cost card. I think this guy's pretty darn intriguing. Keep an eye on this one. It could really help things like Zoo refine and play much, much stronger. Moving on to Banana Vendor, a 3-mana 2/4. Battlecry, add 2 bananas to each player's hand. So some interesting little spell synergy options opening up here for the Banana Vendor, much like the banana dude we saw before, who does a very similar thing where you get the bananas yourself. Which, never count that out, because having extra spells in hand for some decks can be very powerful, whether that's cycling off Auctioneer or activating Mana Cyclones or whatever it is. That's pretty cool. The symmetrical aspect here is a little bit concerning because it does suck sometimes to give your opponent extra resources, particularly those that if you're playing a slower, more reactive deck, they're going to put in their minions, they're going to hit you really hard with the extra bananas. It's going to smoothen out their curve. And the 2/4 body on this 3-drop isn't enough to really slow all that down. So, cards like this always have that weird potential where the spells just matter so much, the Quest Mage style thing of old. But most of the time, decks aren't going to look too closely at this one. I think it'll be pretty easy to pass up because of that symmetrical downside of the Banana Vendor. Next up's Darkmoon Dirigible, a 3-mana 3/2 mech with Divine Shield and Corrupt Gain Rush. So, interesting card. I don't think a 3-mana 3/2 Divine Shield is terrible in its own right. In Arena, you'd be pretty pumped about that sometimes, I'm sure. And then the Rush upside, he's great. Take a trade, survive thanks to the Divine Shield. That's pretty cool. But, in Constructed Hearthstone, I just don't think this is directed enough to really be better or surpass cards that are fitting a game plan perfectly. If you had some deck that cared exactly about Divine Shield synergies and activations and Rush and was willing to wait until turn 5 to do this with the Corrupt, or cared about mechs, I guess, there's a potential home for this somewhere, but you've sliced things so thin. It's what deck is going to want all of those things, or even a combination of a few of those things? Most 3-drops are going to be more refined, more directed to the game plan, and that means this probably just won't be good enough. Moving on here to the Darkmoon Statue, and it's a 0/5. It reads, your other minions have +1 attack, and Corrupt, this gains +4 attack. So on occasion here, a 3-mana 4/5 that comes down in the mid game, say turn 5 would probably be the most natural point for this. And then it's got sort of a raid leader style bonus, which, in certain token decks that need a way to solidify wide boards into damage, say Paladin, which lacks a Savage Roar or Bloodlust, this could be that Bloodlust-esque replacement. I mean, it's still only 1 attack, so it's not that great, but it's also maybe a 4/5 as well. So it does, in some ways, split up your board where your opponent has to either deal with a 4/5 or deal with all the little 1/1s lingering around. That could create some problems. So I don't think this is totally insane to suggest in something like a Silverhand Recruit token Paladin. That might be one of the only places for it, because other token decks or classes probably just have better ways to create that follow-up via Bloodlust, Savage Roar, etc. So it's probably limited in its potential use cases, which is not a great sign, because that means that exact deck has to work and has to want this, which won't always be the case. But it's not a total throwaway card either. I can see a line for it. Moving on to the Gyreworm here. It's a 3-mana 3/2 elemental, And it's got a battle cry. If you played an elemental last turn, deal 3 damage. So that's nice. 3 damage can go face, can go into a minion. You just have to have this elemental condition satisfied. We've certainly seen a few elemental cards pop in for Mage in particular this expansion, so that might be a possibility. We also saw a 2-drop elemental, so this is a pretty natural on-curve play as well. And I think it'd be a solid one, certainly. Kill your opponent's 3/3, develop a little extra stat, continue the elemental chain. All those things are great. But again, it's a card that's going to require a very specific deck list to take off. That's a lot of risk to bear here for the Gyreworm, because right now, Elementals is not a competitive archetype at all. More could be printed in the future, though, so always a possibility for a card like this one to come in, because this is definitely a very efficient effect and a very strong card when it works, so one to keep an eye on. Moving on to the Kathir Ritualist, a 3-mana 4/4 with Taunt, so slightly upstatted here with Taunt, but a battle cry that adds a random 4-cost minion to your opponent's hand. And this is an interesting card, right? You're getting a better than average minion, but only barely, I would say. In the scheme of like impressive Hearthstone things, 3-mana 4/4s just don't really hold up these days. There's a lot more impressive stuff happening, even at 3 mana in many cases. And there's the natural downside that you give your opponent an on-curve thing to do after you play your Kathir Ritualist. Now, in many cases, that 4-cost minion is going to be a throwaway that really doesn't have much impact on the game at all, because they either have something better to do or it's just a really weak random minion. So I don't think that's as much of a downside. I just don't think there's much upside in the 3-mana 4/4. I don't think that's enough on its own. To bundle it with a downside feels particularly problematic. I don't think there's any like mill outs here where you're filling your opponent's hands. So Kathir Ritualist just kind of seems doomed for mediocrity at best. Next up is the Circus Amalgam, a new 4-mana 4/5 with Taunt. And this minion has all minion types. So another Amalgam. And I love the kind of variation on the Amalgam style here with the dragon head, pirate hat on top. This is one of the sicker looking Amalgams we've seen. And this is always an intriguing minion because N'Zoth cares about taunt minions, I think. And this isn't a terrible minion to resummon off of N'Zoth. And if you care about pirates or dragons or elementals or whatever else, you could probably throw this in and not feel awful about it. You know, it's not exciting to play a 4-mana 4/5 taunt, but if it's satisfying some other game plan or condition, then sure, why not toss the sucker in? Maybe it fills a need that doesn't otherwise exist. Next up is the Circus Medic, a 4-mana 3/4 battle cry, restore 4 health, and Corrupt, deal 4 damage instead. And this is a really cool use on Corrupt. We haven't yet seen one that is not just like a magnification. Usually it's changing the card in the same direction, just like making it better. This actually kind of flips what the card does instead, which I'm glad to see we got a variation here on Corrupt. And it's an intriguing one, and because at the front half it's very defensive in nature. You get to restore 4 health. That's reasonable, you know, it's a kind of antique heal body sort range where you're just playing a minion and healing. Again, I don't think that's probably efficient enough for most decks to care about. Very rarely is healing enough these days. It's more about swings and crazy tempo turns than just kind of like staying alive long enough. That's not a game plan that usually works. But the Corrupted version's a really nice swing card, certainly, whether that's going face or just trading into a minion. 4-mana 3/4 dealing 4 is awesome. The problem, as always, though, is that it's one that has to come down pretty late in the game. And I think, interestingly enough, the health on this one might be more valuable in the late game, where you're just trying to make sure you don't die to that top deck kill command and you're desperately clinging to health. Whereas the damage aspect might be more early or more valuable on like turn 4, where you're trying to retain some tempo and you're killing like a 4/4 minion or a 3/3 minion in the mid game. So this is almost flipped, I think, in when it would be most valuable. I think I'd rather have the heal post-corrupt and the damage pre-corrupt as far as most like control-ier game plans are concerned. And if you're looking for like face damage out of it, I don't know if it's good enough, right? Like there's other better face damage cards. So I think this one's going to fall in that little awkward gap where it doesn't really do what you need it to do when it's happening, and a little bit slow for corrupt, unfortunately, and just doesn't do quite enough. So a very interesting design, an intriguing card for sure. I don't think a great one though. Moving on to Fantastic Firebird, a 4-mana 3/5 elemental with Wind Fury. So pretty base card here. Nothing too exciting about this one. We've seen a lot of Wind Fury stuff like this not really get there in the past. I don't think the elemental tag really changes the aspect of this card where it's suddenly worth it because of elemental synergies or something. I mean, if you had to fill a curve with enough elementals, perhaps this gets tossed in there, but it's not going to be a key card. It's going to feel like card number 30 or really one of the weaker cards in the list because I currently don't see anything for elementals that particularly supports Wind Fury or synergizes with that in an interesting way with like attack buffs. So this feels more like filler than a really powerful card. I just don't think it's very good. Next up, here's the Knife Vendor, a 4-mana 3/4. Battlecry, deal 4 damage to each hero. So a lot of damage output here, but you're taking some yourself, which I actually think is a big downfall for this card. I've noticed lately a lot of aggro matchups just end up being races. You know, it's like, man, I got to kill my opponent before they kill me. And this introduces risk in those scenarios. Like, not every matchup's going to be an aggro matchup. Sometimes you like damage output if you're playing against Priest or something. But you got to run this card in your list, and you're going to queue into Hunter sometimes, and this is not going to be safe to play unless you can secure lethal exactly the same turn it's played, which means that like 1 or 2 extra damage that this provides over some alternative card that does a similar thing may not really be worth the risk. You probably just want to run something that's unidirectional in its damage. There are a lot of ways to do damage in Hearthstone. This does not feel like a particularly safe or compelling one, so I think most lists will just avoid this one at all costs. I guess there's like some potential like Pain Warlock stuff where you like damaging yourself and this accelerates your Flesh Giants and stuff, but it feels like a big chunk of damage. I don't know if that deck needs as much face damage against the opponent, so are there better ways to do self-damage as well? Probably. The Derailed Coaster here is a new 5-mana 3/2. Battlecry, summon a 1/1 rider with Rush for each minion in your hand. Home run on the flavor here. All your minions are riding on a roller coaster. It gets derailed because of some tentacles or who knows what else. And suddenly they're represented by a bunch of riders on board running for their life. And you know what? This is an intriguing card to me. I think this is kind of cool. I don't think you need a lot of 1/1 rushes here to make this interesting. Maybe like 3 to 4 1/1 rushes. A lot of decks can have 3 to 4 minions in hand still by the time they reach turn 5. So maybe this is something that offers like a cool little swing on turn 5. Maybe it's a token deck of some sort that cares about getting a lot of minions on board. So it's intriguing. That said, you know, it's still like a lot of token decks have a ton of spells in hand. Control decks probably just have bigger things they can do that aren't as demanding from a hand standpoint if they want to run a lot of spells. So it's probably going to end up being more awkward than useful, but it actually does quite a bit for a 5-drop if you look at it closely. So I wouldn't be totally shocked if this crawled into a list somewhere. And then I believe finally our last card here might just be the Carnival Clown, a horrifying 9-mana 4/4 with Taunt and Battlecry. Summon 2 copies of this. If you corrupt it, you can also fill your board with 4/4 taunts. That said, corrupting a 9-drop is particularly challenging because you either have to discount this a ton or play a 10-mana card naturally to pull that off. So I don't think corrupt here is much consideration at all, which is a shame because it would actually be pretty interesting to summon a full board of 4/4s. Like, yeah, Flame Strike exists, but that's a lot of stuff. And I'm even like a little bit intrigued by the base version of this, summoning 2 copies. Any kind of like Battlecry shenanigan or hand buff stuff would make this a really big board development. So will this card see play? Probably not. It's probably just too big and too slow, and the corrupt is not worth it. So it probably gets left out a lot. But, you know, a hand buff deck, a taunt hand buff deck, like maybe this just gets big enough that you're playing like 3 10/10s for 9 mana, and that's like a game-winning play. So I'm gonna like keep the door open for Carnival Clown here a little bit. I can see a hand buff Taunt Warrior world where this makes sense. And you know, we talked about that like 3-mana 5/5 hand buff spell where I was like, well, you definitely don't want that hitting just 1 minion. You're overcommitting. Well, if it hits your Carnival Clown, that's suddenly 3 minions. They're all 9/9s. I don't hate it, right? Suddenly I'm intrigued. So we're going to play around with this card, and I'm actually going to give it 3 stars, I think. I think it's promising. All right, so we're going to do some quick reviews here. It's not going to be in the same order. We're just going to go in alphabetical order of classes here. So up first is Faire Arborist. It's a 4-star card. Moon Touched Amulet is a 1-star card. Umbral Owl is a 3-star card. Insight is a 3-star card. Fairground Fool is a 2-star card. Gahun the Blood God is a 3-star card. Blood of Gahun is a 3-star card. Midway Maniac is a 2-star card. Free Admission is a 4-star card. Menari Mosher is a 4-star card. Ring Matron is a 4-star card. Stage Dive is a 4-star card. Bumper Car is a 2-star card. Minefield is a 3-star card. Stagehand is a 2-star card. Feat of Strength is a 2-star card. Sword Eater, I'm going to say it's a 5-star card. I think it's going to get played a lot. That's a bold claim, I get it, but I'm going to say 5 stars. Safety Inspector is a 3-star card. Costume Entertainer is a 2-star card. Parade Leader is a 1-star card. Prize Vendor is a 2-star card. Rock Rager is a 2-star card. Showstopper is a 2-star card. Wriggling Horror, I'm gonna say it's 5 stars, guys. I think this card's actually sleeper, really strong in tempo decks. I like this one a lot. Banana Vendor is a 2-star card. Darkmoon Dirigible is a 2-star card. Darkmoon Statue is a 3-star card. Gyreworm is a 4-star card. Kathir Ritualist is a 1-star card. Circus Amalgam is a 4-star card. Circus Medic is a 2-star card. Fantastic Firebird is a 2-star card. Knife Vendor is a 2-star card. Derailed Coaster is a 2-star card. Carnival Clown is a 3-star card. All right, folks, so that wraps it up. We're going to leave the Carnival Clown on screen here to close our Darkmoon Faire card reviews. That guy will haunt my nightmares, I'm sure, at the end of the day. So, again, thanks for joining me. Share your thoughts on all these cards. As always, we never get it right all the time. It's really more about talking and having fun and just hashing out ideas. Who cares if we're right or wrong? It's just to have fun and hype things up. So stay tuned, man. We're going to be playing these cards very soon. Tomorrow, if you're watching this video right away, because we're doing the theory crafting stream, and then we're going to have some deck recipes in the pre-release weekend. So decks are coming immediately for these cards. A lot of cool stuff on the way, so I hope you'll join me. Stick around, maybe drop some subs to show the appreciation and hype for future videos covering all this stuff, like the Carnival Clown Taunt Warrior. It's coming. So, love you all a ton. Thanks much, as always, for watching, and until next time, game on.